Welcome to Ilivision.
Hercules was part black. The evidence. In this episode, we reveal the lineage and part black African ancestry of Hercules, better known as Heracles to the Greeks. Surprising that some individuals believe that these are two different persons, and equally surprising to many, I'm sure, that his ancestry was in part black. The evidence here is based on ancient Greek sources such as Hesiod, Pseudo-Apollodorus, Herodotus, and Diodorus Siculus, all greats who are acknowledged sources of ancient Greek mythology and history. We will trace Heracles' lineage backwards. Here's the evidence to consider. Heracles' mother was Alcmene, whom Hesiod described as surpassing the tribe of women in beauty and height, and that no one, man or woman, was as wise as she was. Alcmene became pregnant with Heracles when Zeus tricked her into bed. Zeus had on many occasions transformed into other forms such as a swan, an eagle, and even golden rain to trick his way into the bed of women. On this occasion, he took the form of her husband, Amphitryon, while said husband was away. Zeus certainly made the most of it, as he made one night with Alcmene last for 3 nights by ordering the sun god Helios not to rise for 3 days. The result of this 3-day union was Alcmene becoming pregnant and giving birth to Heracles. Because Zeus was a god and his father, this made Heracles a demigod, so a part black, half god. Now, Alcmene's father was Electrion, and Electrion was of mixed race, half black and half white. This was the result of his mother being black and his father white. Electrion's father was Perseus, the great Greek hero best known for slaying the Gorgon Medusa. It was on his way back from this quest that he found himself in a land that the ancient Greeks called Ethiopia, spelt with an A at the beginning. Ethiopia does not relate to modern-day Ethiopia, but a land and a population that was different to the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Libyans. Both ancient Greek historians, Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, mention Meroe as being the capital of Ethiopia, and therefore an area located more around modern-day Sudan. Check out our episode on Africans in Greek mythology for more detail on this, but to clarify, Herodotus claims that this land of Ethiopia was south of Egypt. So we're not inclined to believe that this land nor its inhabitants were of North African origin, and certainly nowhere near the Mediterranean. To confirm the black African location of Ethiopia, Diodorus Siculus describes the inhabitants of Ethiopia as black in color and have flat noses and woolly hair. A perfect description for the physical characteristics of Africans who live south of the Sahara. And it is not only ancient Greek historians and poets that mention and describe the Ethiopians. The description of the Ethiopians can also be found in ancient Greek philosophy, where the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes describes the Ethiopians as flat-nosed and black. This is all important as Heracles' grandfather, Electrion, well, his mother was the princess of this land, Ethiopia, and her name was Andromeda. Perseus found Andromeda chained to a rock surrounded by water. This was a result of her mother's hubris. Her mother, Cassiopeia, queen of Ethiopia, had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids. The Nereids were sea nymphs, and being of the sea, the god of the sea, Poseidon, was greatly angry. Such was his infuriation that he flooded the land and set a sea monster upon Ethiopia. The only way to save the land was for Queen Cassiopeia and her husband, King Cepheus, to sacrifice their daughter, Andromeda, to this sea monster. See our episode Black Africans in Greek Myth Constellations for more on this story, but in short, Perseus comes along at this point. He rescues Andromeda. Not only does he rescue her, but immediately falls deeply in love with her and marries her. It is one of few narratives in Greek mythology with a happy ending, and where the female protagonist is not abducted. Yup, Andromeda also falls deeply in love with Perseus and, more than willingly, goes with him. They have a number of mixed-race children, of which one is the mixed-race Electrion, and Hercules' grandfather, making Hercules' great-grandmother the Black African Ethiopian princess Andromeda. Ovid, the great and notable Roman poet, also claims that Andromeda was black in his work Heroides, writing not only of the deep love that Perseus and Andromeda had for each other, but of their difference in colour. He writes, "Dark Andromeda was beautiful to Perseus, though she was dark with the colour of her native land. What is more, white pigeons often mate with birds of a darker colour." I know that some will be resistant to the information that Andromeda, Hercules' great-grandmother, was African and black, but the evidence has been cited and references provided by ancient Greek historians who were closer to the matter and have a more accurate view of where Ethiopia was located. It is important to conduct independent research to uncover a broader range of perspectives, rather than relying solely on preconceived notions. As we delve further into historical sources, the evidence tends to be less influenced by later interpretations. The literary evidence and insights presented here aim to foster a more inclusive understanding of Greek mythology and race in ancient history. Recapping the evidence. After a criticism of the video Black Africans in Greek Myth Constellations, which was described as being propaganda and lies and other delightful descriptions, here we endeavour to clarify and solidify the threads of information from ancient Greek historians, geographers, and mythographers that justifies and validates the version that Andromeda was African and black, and address the version that history has chosen to perpetuate, that the Andromeda narrative was based in Iope, also referred to as Jaffa, or what is modern-day Jaffa on the coast of Israel. There are links in the description to refer to the information here presented. Ethiopia. In terms of Ethiopia, we know that this was an expansive land and a population that were different from the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Libyans, and does not relate to modern-day Ethiopia. Herodotus, the Greek historian and geographer, stated that this land of Ethiopia was south of Egypt, and its capital city was said to be Meroe, which is in modern-day Sudan. Herodotus also stated that the inhabitants of this land have black skins and woolly hair. Another notable ancient Greek historian, Diodorus Siculus, writes of the Ethiopians. He states in Book 3 that these Ethiopians are black in color and have flat noses and woolly hair, and that Meroe was the most famous of their cities. There are numerous references to the Ethiopians in Book 3 as a large population of many different groups spanning an expansive land. As previously mentioned, we also find reference to the Ethiopians in ancient Greek philosophy, with the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes describing the Ethiopians as flat-nosed and black in Fragment 16. Taking the accounts of these ancient Greek sources, we should have a firm and undeniable view of the ancient Greek perspective of the location of Ethiopia and the physical characteristics of its inhabitants. Hercules' lineage. Regarding Hercules' lineage, that his mother was Alcmene, her father was Electrion, and that Electrion's parents were Andromeda and Perseus, is confirmed by many sources, including Hesiod in his work The Shield of Heracles, Euripides in his play Alcestis, Pseudo-Apollodorus in Book 2, and by Diodorus Siculus in Book 4, Section 8, titled On Heracles. The Ethiopian Andromeda and Family. Now, on to Andromeda and her family and whether they were from Ethiopia. The mythographer Pseudo-Apollodorus states that they were Ethiopian in Book 2, where the entire myth is presented and is perhaps influenced by the work of the ancient Greek mythographer Pherecydes, who flourished in the 6th century BCE. There is evidence that both Sophocles' and Euripides' play Andromeda suggests an Ethiopian setting, and Eratosthenes, a generally brilliant ancient Greek and third director of the Great Library at Alexandria, who is well known for his writing on astral mythology, states that Cepheus was the king of Ethiopia and father to Andromeda. The version that Andromeda and her family were from Iope, also known as Joppa or modern-day Jaffa on the coast of Israel, is indeed the one that history has, surprisingly, chosen to perpetuate. References to this version are often associated with Strabo and Pliny. See links in the description to read an interesting and scholarly analysis of the Andromeda myth and its location, which refers to the standard version of the myth, which was later reinterpreted in such a way that it was relocated to Iope, or modern-day Jaffa. There is another link to a published scholarly analysis of the Perseus myth, which corroborates this thought and also points to the fact that it was indeed Strabo who acknowledged that Ethiopians' claim to the Andromeda story preceded Joppa's, as stated by Strabo himself, who writes, "And there are some who transfer Ethiopia to the Phoenicia near us, and they say that the Andromeda story took place in Joppa." Prior to this, we do find a reference to the Andromeda myth being associated with Joppa in a work attributed to Pseudo-Scylax, but this compared to the abundance of references robustly placing the Andromeda myth in Ethiopia. It is a debate that has raged for millennia, but we know that Ovid definitively described Andromeda as black, and Philostratus, the Greek sophist, definitively confirms the African setting of the Perseus and Andromeda myth, writing, "No, this is not the Red Sea, nor the inhabitants of India, but Ethiopians and a Greek man in Ethiopia." And was it so strange that Perseus turned up in Africa for the Andromeda narrative? No, not at all. It is asserted by Herodotus in Book 2 that the Gorgons, one of whom was Medusa, slayed by Perseus, resided in Libya, in North Africa. The location of the Gorgons is corroborated in the works of Apollonius of Rhodes, author of the Argonautica, and by Lucian of Samosata in Book 14. And of course there's the narrative of Perseus turning the Titan, Atlas, into stone and thus creating the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. So it is not at all strange that Perseus was to be found on the continent of Africa. Art. The depiction of Andromeda in ancient Greek art provides an additional dimension to the debate surrounding her ethnicity. Despite abundant literary sources situating Andromeda in Ethiopia, visual representations do not portray her as black, nor is there strong evidence of such portrayals in ancient theatrical performances. Greek artists and playwrights would have likely adapted the character of Andromeda to suit their contemporary audiences. primarily Greeks, resulting in her depiction as fair-skinned or white to maintain cultural continuity. A notable example of the middle ground being taken is a vase found at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The vase shows Andromeda with fair skin, despite her identification as Ethiopian. However, she is depicted alongside fellow Ethiopians with black skin and other features highlighting the African characteristics of fellow Ethiopian figures. Her father, Cepheus, whilst portrayed also with fair skin, possesses typically African features such as curly hair and thick lips and an upturned nose, as described by the museum. This blending of features reflects perhaps cultural continuity, where mythological figures were, unsurprisingly, visually adapted to align with the aesthetic norms and cultural expectations of the targeted Greek audience. In conclusion, there is an abundance of literary evidence of the Andromeda myth being located in Ethiopia, a land south of Egypt, with the inhabitants bearing the undeniable physical characteristics of black Africans living south of the Sahara. Greek mythology is fluid. There are other later versions of the myth, Jaffa, and even India. But considering the relative paucity of literary evidence for these, none of these invalidate the older Ethiopian version. On the basis of the Ethiopian version and the evidence here presented, then Andromeda was of Africa, was black, and her great grandson, Hercules, was in part black.